समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
But what Iran has done very effectively is say, you have the watch, we have the time.
No, from a purely academic point of view, all the protagonists in this war have been rational actors. There have been no irrational steps so far.
I don't know. In the long run, everything seems rational, but in the long run, we all die.
Of course, there is a question on platforms. That's one variable. There's another question on systems and subsystems. That's another variable. Then there is data and the feedback loop. And the feedback loop and data also has its own chains, right? And then there is human intelligence.
So as we are moving away from essentially a tributary system where you have a security provider that has exquisite platforms and everyone builds their interoperability on these supplies from the United States.
Strategic community, I would say, has been blindsided for far too long based on what we need to worry about immediately versus what we need to think about a couple of years down the road.
So I do not think we're going to have a ground-based invasion. I think I have to take exception on the idea that all actors have been rational, but this would be completely irrational.
Chinese equipment did not work, doesn't work is a thesis. The jury's out on that one. There are not enough data points to call it out conclusively.
I've given up trying to predict. Maybe I'm not rational enough, but I don't think people have the treasure and the weapons to do it.
Welcome to the Worldview with Swasti. As you know that we're keeping a keen eye on how the security situation is unfolding in the Middle East region. The war that started on 28th of February is now entering its third week. And one thing is very clear, even if we do not have answers to the larger political questions, that this war is here to stay. It has already become a war of grinding attrition. And there's one thing that keeps coming to mind, which is that these GCC countries, the rich monarchies of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., they spent billions of dollars in buying security. But were those weapons enough to also allow them to fight the war, and especially a war of grinding attrition? So this situation and this problem has been taken up several times when it came to this gap between offensive and defensive costs. And to understand that better, I have two very good experts with me. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Ilia Rubanis, who is visiting us from the UK. He's a very noted, well-known expert on the defense industry value ecosystem of the Gulf. He is a specialist of how the cross-cutting of defense value chains are happening and all the security architecture of the Gulf region. So, Ilia, very happy to welcome you to the studio this time.
Thank you, and thank you for your warm words.
And my second expert today, of course, is Group Captain Ajay Ahlawat, who is going to help us understand also what kind of lessons can India learn from it. Because as we know, as we were preparing for this discussion, news came that India has formally expressed interest for a 6th generation aircraft. So is it about generation and more generations, advanced generations of aircrafts, or is it about sort of changing that philosophy to really get that dollar for dollar, value for your defense equipment? So these are kind of things that I guess are in everybody's minds, and this is what we are going to be discussing today. So gentlemen, welcome to the Worldview and very pleased to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Well, Dr. Rao, thank you for inviting me, and I feel happy, in fact privileged, to be sharing the screen space with Professor Ilia, and thank you.
All right, let's start with Ilia. Ilia, you have been a keen sort of observer on the situation in the Middle Eastern region. Of course, as I said that, I think the rich monarchies of the Gulf invested billions and billions of dollars in advanced fighter aircrafts and all of that they keep buying. Please also tell the viewers about it. And what they were buying, I think, was security, right? But they have been forced with a war they never really wanted to have. The war has pretty much expanded. And what we now see is that they are not able to use those expensive weapons in a cost-effective manner in a grinding war of attrition. So they are not able to use those weapons that they invested billions of dollars in. Quickly, how do you see this unfolding?
So what the Gulf comes to realize is they don't have strategic depth. The whole model was based on the idea that they would never have to fight a war. And the idea was that you buy defense to deter the possibility, even the thought of war. And this has gone on for decades. And in a way, the Gulf shares the same issue with Europe. Europe was not supposed to fight the war.
Yeah.
So as we are moving away from essentially a tributary system where you have a security provider that has exquisite platforms and everyone builds their interoperability on these supplies from the United States with the idea that that will secure deterrence. You won't fight an actual war. But when you go into a war situation, you need, and you do not have a security provider, you find out that arms are for use. And the arms that are for use in a very short, when you don't have strategic depth, exquisite platforms make sense because you want a quick victory. But what Iran has done very effectively is say, you have the watch, we have the time. And now they're turning this into a war of attrition, which nobody expected. One has to ask why nobody expected it. I have really no idea. And the attack on energy infrastructure in Iran means that all gloves are off. Now, that means if we go for in-kind retaliation, that would even hurt the economic base of the Gulf. So everything is under threat. And the threat in itself, apart from what happens operationally, has certain effects. Like no ship can be insured. So this is escalating. So it's changing also the calculation of what arms you need to buy. And for the last 7 to 8 years, and at least since the Yemeni campaign that involved both the Emiratis and the Saudis, there was a drive towards localization because they needed resilient supply chains then.
Okay.
And when the crisis started, there were supply chain hiccups because their European providers had second thoughts on whether they wanted to support the campaign in Yemen. They ended up doing it because the private sector is the private sector, with circumventing political obstacles. But the Gulf learned that they needed their own local supply chains. And there are very few powers with whom they could have a symmetrical relationship that would allow the transfer not only of the technology transfer, data transfer, and human capacity transfer. And none of them is European. And I'll leave it at that.
So quick, I mean, some interesting observations you made. One side has the watch, but the other side has the time. And also you mentioned localization, that in the Indian strategic discourse, we refer more as indigenization. And of course, this is something which is a very, I would say, vibrant debate in India, in our defense procurement philosophy. However, going back to Ajay, and Ajay, I want you to pitch in here a couple of things. Of course, I'm sure you would want to add something to what Ilia just mentioned, but also another thing, which is that, when we are looking at it from India, so, there is a Russia-Ukraine war happening, which is already in its 5th year. There are, of course, lessons drawn all the time. Everybody is learning their lessons. What lessons have India drawn from there? And just about the situation in the Gulf as well, which is again the same thing, which is that large platforms are not able to buy you security. And then when you get a grinding war of attrition, you basically have to need, you need weapons that are also cost effective. So this also has to be customized, obviously, to the Indian experience. I mean, things do not work in isolation. But quickly, your thoughts on how should we look at it from the Indian perspective? And then please feel free to add whatever you wish to add.
Okay, a couple of questions there. Let me take them one by one. First of all, I would like to add one layer to what Professor Ilia said. Look at the countries involved in the war besides Iran, Israel, and US. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, UAE, and others. None of them are democracy. So what are they fighting? They're fighting at two levels. One against the foreign aggression from Iran. But please note, none of them, and they have very reasonable air forces, none of them have carried out offensive strikes against targets in Iran. Because they're fighting at two levels. One is against the aggression caused by Iran, but two, also to preserve the legitimacy of their own system of government.
Yeah.
The largely Muslim populations does not necessarily see US and Israel as partners. So they are in a very tight spot. They are currently expending a large amount of defensive weapons and ammunition trying to protect themselves, but they have not unleashed the sizable and credible offensive capability at their disposal. So this is just one additional point I wanted to add to what Dr. Ilia has already mentioned. Coming to the second part of questions, what is India learning? Not just India, any major military power observes wars that they are not involved in. Because how do you create theories and doctrines and create your training patterns, etc.? You create a theory or you test a theory through exercises or see how it plays out in war. The theories that withstand the test of wars or exercises become doctrines. So we look at all wars, we study them keenly. The major lessons emerging out of Russia-Ukraine war was use of drones, AI, autonomous system, persistent surveillance, and we seeing the same lessons being relearned here in Iran. So yes, the Indian military is watching it very closely, keenly, and we're trying to see what can we pick from this entire experience and focus it on our organizations, our force structure, our equipment, whether we build them or procure them. So a lot of lessons being learned there.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that, because basically what we see, we have a situation where the Russia-Ukraine war has not ended, but it has sort of, gotten stretched onto the Middle Eastern situation, because now you have Ukrainian drone experts being called there because they have cheap solutions to take down the Shahid. So we'll come to that. And I'm glad you touched upon that. And I would also like to touch upon the aspect of reverse engineering that we see unfolding on the part of the United States using the Lucas drone. But coming back to Ilia, please also help us understand, because this is something that you've been mentioning in your writings and also in the recent lecture that you just gave at St. George that I also attended, where you focused a bit and you asked the Indian strategic community to also sort of analyze the doctrinal difference and the doctrinal sort of shift. Could you help the viewers understand in an easy enough manner what do you mean when you are asking the strategic communities around the world, at least the major defense players, to look at this doctrinal difference and the doctrinal transition? What exactly are you referring to?
So if we talk about arms, so what the Gulf has already started doing, even before this crisis, is that localization is not making a platform indigenous.
Okay.
It's not made. It's not a made in the Gulf policy as such. It is bringing in the thought about design, about rethinking what do you defend and how, and what is a threat, what are your priorities. And for example, you see one of the major localization partners is Turkey.
Okay.
And you see now that the Emiratis are experimenting with Emirati payloads on Turkish drones. So you have an Emirati missile. What does that do? It increases resilience. It says, if I won't wait to be supplied in the case of war, I won't have to fight for interceptors, for example. I'll be producing my own. So you're taking lessons on what needs to be more resilient when the crisis starts. I think one major thing that I am scared of as the next step of escalation, and we already had an indication of that, there is a very close loop between energy and water infrastructure. And right now, the Gulf is totally dependent on desalination.
Yeah.
Now, if that becomes a constant and persistent target, then the Iranians will have both the watch and the time,
Okay.
because that is a ticking bomb, in a sense. And we have to watch the escalation ladder really carefully.
Okay.
So doctrinally, we have certain aspects of defense that because of the shallow strategic depth, the Gulf states have to completely rethink it.
Okay.
And they will need localization partners. And who are the parties that can symmetrically speak to the Gulf states? It's not the superpowers that want A to Z ownership of what they produce, to invest in R&D, to go further up and develop even more exquisite platforms. It's countries like India, it's countries like Turkey, the so-called middle powers.
Okay. Right, interesting point. Also, I think, Ilia, you alluded to one of the points that you mentioned in your lecture, of course, that I found very interesting, was that even if you look at the Gulf, I mean, there is a bit of a layering there as well. There's an additional difference, which is that if you look at the Saudi model, it prefers to co-produce, right? And if you look at the Emirati model, it is more sophisticated, it goes for more modular integration and subsystems integration. So do you think that in coming times, that's what I gathered from what you just told me, that you would really see the Emirati model becoming more and more prevalent because of the inherent sophistication and the strengths that it has had, at least?
Well, I think it's a matter of they're both in a race, and the Emirati started earlier.
Okay.
So the Emirati Arms Expo was one of the few places in the world where you could have in one room IRGC and in the other room the IDF presenting their platforms. And they started by producing, let's say, consumables, and now they're going up the value chain. I think the Saudis are learning, are more on the ground level, getting the basics, setting the foundations on their ecosystem.
Right. All right. Ajay, when you hear all this, and of course, Dr. Rubanis mentioned that the countries that are going to be more sort of relevant, maybe even if we don't have the scenario right away, but because we are trying to understand how this is going to unfold. And he mentioned India, he mentioned other countries like Turkey, etc. You know, in India, we are very, very familiar with what happens when you have a weapon that you cannot use. And doctrinally, again, we have been more and more aware of how should we get only platforms that we can use and also get them more and more indigenized. And that is the whole philosophy of the indigenized content, right? And then the RDAP basically says that you have to have a higher degree of indigenized content, etc. That's how it looks on the paper. You help me understand, when you see the air warfare evolving now, what are your takeaways from all this subsystem modular integration, big platforms? You know, help us demystify the cloud a little bit, also for the audiences to understand in an easy manner.
Allow me a little bit of latitude. I'll
Sure.
first zoom out and then try and zoom in. So a perfectly made national security strategy would be weapon system agnostic. You know, it would answer the question that we make it here completely, locally, we import the best system, or we choose a hybrid model. We build what we can or import what we can. In that sense, without specifying the weapon system, ideally made national security strategy would answer this. So what is the NSS we speak of? So you look at what you have in terms of the elements of national power, soft power, hard power. Then you look at what worries you, what is your threat, what concerns you. And then on top of it, you impose national ambition. Where do you want to be? So based on all this, you come out with the national security strategy. Out of this strategy must evolve the doctrines of the armed forces, land, air, sea, etc. And from this doctrine, we must, lay down our procurement procedures, tactics, training, etc., and all that. So what is actually happening is we are in a situation of putting the cart before the horse, or in some cases, we get a cart and then we look for a horse. So the weapon system cannot drive doctrine. It should be the other way around in an ideal scenario.
Yeah.
So the bigger picture, what do we have? What do we worry about? Where we want to be, like Viksit Bharat dream in 2047.
Could you give a few examples also for the viewers to understand when you said that sometimes we first get the horse and then we start looking for the cart? It's a very interesting observation, and I don't want the audience to miss this point.
Currently what is happening is we look at a weapon system. You mentioned in opening comments like the 6th generation fighter aircraft.
Yeah.
There are discussions, there are news reports that India would be interested.
Yeah.
But we haven't heard where will it fit in. There is a large amount of time, treasure has been invested in the domestic fighter program, LCA, Mark 1, 1A, Mark 2, AMCA. Where does the money come from for the 6th generation aircraft?
Yeah.
Will we give up on some of our domestic ambitions or stuff like that? So everything must flow from the NSS, leading to the military or the domain specific doctrines. And from that, we must see, okay, this procurement links to this gap, which has been identified by the doctrine. So in that sense, we're missing that part.
Right.
We're hearing fancy equipment, nice, good, lot of capabilities, 5th gen, 6th gen, etc. But what does it fulfill? We want to compel Pakistan to do our bidding. We want to deter China so that China does not force us to do our bidding. Will this weapon system make us do that? If not, then we have to relook at it.
Right. So something that you mentioned, which I've also found very, very useful in trying to understand this complex, situation that we have at hand. So I do get a feeling that here in India, at least, and Dr. Rubanis, I would like your observations on it. That here in India, we have been more oriented towards having large platforms, right? I mean, power projection. In many senses, right? Although the recent experiences of the wars have taught us, and of course we are learning our lessons. This is not that, I'm just trying to tell you the approach, the difference in the approach. So we do see that we have had this penchant for, or this, proclivity towards large weapons platforms, like you mentioned. But on the other hand, I think perhaps we need more cost-effective solutions, more network-centric, solutions, etc. Would you also like to sort of delve a little bit on that? I mean, how do you, when you look at the situation unfolding like in real wars, and then when you look at India, because I know that Europeans and Gulf also, we have a very close and defense relationship also with these partners. Where do these variables fit in?
So I think depending on the level of development you have in this ecosystem, you have the privilege of either importing platforms or importing systems or importing larger or sharing data. For example,
Okay.
So one thing that is important both in Europe particularly, but also in the Gulf to understand is that not all alliances are about collective defense. And not all alliances are about single platforms and interoperability. When you reach a maturity of 70 years like NATO,
Yeah.
You reach that level, yes. But that doesn't mean that there is nothing before that.
Okay.
So partners like Pakistan and Turkey share data because they have life battle experience. They share doctrinal experience. How do weapons respond? They share questions. How do you address this specific problem? Like you lose control of the drone. What do you do?
Right.
You see a swarm of drones. What do you do? They share the question and they sort of try to put together an answer. They share engineering experience. They share innovation, inspiration, because they have access to different ecosystems, Turkey to NATO, Pakistan to China. And so it's a deep relationship, it's complementary, even if it's not necessarily collective security in a NATO sense of the term,
Right.
Article 5.
Right.
Because we're moving into an anarchical system, disorder, it's world
new
disorder
normal.
is the new norm.
Yeah.
We're going to see, it's going back to the basics in the old term complementary factors of production, let's say.
Okay.
And then alliances will be looked at in that way.
Right. Okay. Very, very valid point. Group Captain Ahlawat, he mentioned something very interesting. So, of course, what you alluded to was about how this thought should be sort of executed, right? So, there has to be a broader vision and then you sort of implement it by way of these strategies. But he's also mentioning something else, which is that you also need to constantly then engage in countries that you call, close partners, because nobody is just looking at the buyer-seller era, that which is very, very evident. So, of course, there is a question on platforms. That's one variable. There's another question on systems and subsystems. That's another variable. Then there is data and the feedback loop. And the feedback loop and data also has its own chains, right? And then there is human intelligence. So, when we in India look at the situation, what are your thoughts on it? Because we are still sort of used to thinking in terms of the problems that we have in the subcontinent. I mean, are these conversations, familiar to us in the Indian strategic conversations? My reading is not so much, but what's your reading?
See, for a very long time, we've been land-centric because our major threat was from two neighbors, we share large land borders. We tend to ignore the fact that we also have a massive maritime presence, which we tend to ignore. This was because we did not perceive a threat from there. So once again, I'll take you back to what I alluded to a little earlier. It must all be driven by our national ambition. Where do we want to see ourselves? If we want partnerships, then partnership must feed or fulfill one or more of aspects of that ambition. What is it that we want to achieve? And partnering with country A versus B versus C, which one fulfills it best in the most economical manner or on more strategically favorable manner?
Right.
So the strategic community, I would say, has been blindsided for far too long based on what we need to worry about immediately versus what we need to think about a couple of years down the road.
All right. And with that, okay, let me just take it with you, Ajay, because I remember I did mention this question of reverse engineering. And for a long time, we in India, of course, we look down upon reverse engineering, like any country that would favor an innovative ecosystem or would aspire for an innovative ecosystem. But now it turns out it's not just China and Turkey that do reverse engineering and do it very well, but it's also the United States of America itself by way of Lucas. So Lucas, like I said, is a reverse engineer Shahid 136. Okay. Your thoughts on that? I mean, how do you look at it? Do you think it is the need that is driving this reverse engineering? How do we approach this conversation on reverse engineering?
So
now?
this Shahid versus Lucas is more of an urban legend than grounded in facts.
Okay.
Admiral Cooper, the CENTCOM commander, mentioned it. He said it's Lucas is indispensable to our game plan. The indispensable part came from the L, which is the low cost in the Lucas.
Yeah.
So both Lucas as well as Shahid, they draw their inspiration from a German design called DAR. It was called Drone Anti-Radar, built in mid-80s, West Germany, and similar Delta platform, similar wingspan, a pusher engine, little lesser of payload.
Okay.
They gave it up because USSR collapsed and they thought no need to go through with it. The Israelis picked it up, and the Harpy and the Haroop, the two drones that we also use.
Yes.
If you look at them, it's very difficult for uninitiated to make out which one is a Shahid and which one is a Haroop. Sizes may matter, Delta platform, engines in the back, that stuff. So it's not new. Shahid gained infamy because of the use by Russians initially, and they copied it, they call it Geran.
Yes.
So that's the journey of, and when US was studying these kind of drones in great details, and they were fascinated by the L aspect of that, low cost aspect of it.
Yeah.
Because unless you can deploy something at scale, it won't have impact. That is the lesson learned in Ukraine as well. You can have the best drone in the world, but unless you can offer it at scale in thousands, it won't cause any impact on the battle lines.
Right.
So that is the point.
Right. Very important point, Deploy first, improve later. It's a culture. Dr. Rubanis, you would like to add to that, please?
Yeah, there is a reason why certain platforms look like each other, because they often respond to the same problem.
Yes.
They are made
Exactly.
to respond to the same problem.
Exactly.
For example, there was a hackathon organized in Greece, and the question posed was air defense, as low cost as possible. And the team of students and engineers essentially came up with something that at the end looked exactly like what the Ukrainians are currently using,
Okay.
because they don't have expensive interceptors.
Right.
And it's not that like people cannot help go on YouTube or research or see whatever they are interested in. But this is not exactly reverse engineering. People are learning. Reverse engineering is another thing. It's like going, piece by piece to go from scrap to rebuilding something.
Right.
But there are innovation paths, and innovation paths are driven from needs. And so the question really is, are you identifying these needs? And can you go beyond established value chain relationships? Because India has a relationship with France. India has a relationship with Russia. India has a relation. So can you go beyond these established relationships to think out of the box and say, am I addressing my needs?
Okay. So lots of interesting points there, Dr. Rubanis. Thank you. And a lot of, I think, points to ponder upon. So in that sense, a lot of strategic ponderables I think you've put in place. But I have to ask this question to Group Captain Ahlawat. Of course, he's a former pilot of the Indian Air Force. Ajay, we've also been seeing how, at least in the last few wars, right, and this is about your domain, we have also been seeing how the Chinese air defenses have not worked. They've been deployed. So they were deployed in Venezuela when Nicolas Maduro was ousted. They were also used by Pakistan against us in Operation Sindoor. And they're very widely used now in this particular Gulf War 3, so to say. Now, Chinese air defenses have not worked, and we have had a lot of discussion also about that. So your quick thoughts on how to look at it. Is it just something which China does because it just wants to have some military presence there? Or do you think this is because China doesn't really give them the real advanced weapons that they own? They use for themselves. This is more the export variant. Or do you think there's something more than meets the eye, which is about establishing a certain feedback loop and getting data, etc., etc.? Ajay, you first.
Chinese equipment did not work, doesn't work is a thesis. The jury's out on that one. There are not enough data points to call it out conclusively.
Okay.
But based on what is being reported and based on the examples that you cited, wherever they were used, especially in our context, they did not work as advertised. That point taken. So, a couple of reasons. One, China never exports the best variant. There is obviously a dumbed down version that is given even to friends and allies.
But that was not the case for PL-15s, isn't it?
We can come to that a little later.
Okay.
The second is how well an equipment works based is two things. One is obviously how well the crew is trained to exploit the fullest extent exploit it to the fullest extent possible, and two is the level of networking or where in the entire scheme of things or network that equipment fits. Two pair adversaries equally armed or equally trained, the one with better network will always win 10 out of 10 times.
Okay.
So that is also something to be researched. Were they networked properly? Was the situational awareness available to the operators adequate? And obviously the quality of adversary will always play a role. US comes with overwhelming advantage in electronics, in communications, and stuff that we don't see, the non-kinetic stuff.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Rubanis, you've had also a different view on the Chinese role in the emerging defense value chains. From what just Group Captain Ahlawat mentioned about, how we have been looking at the Chinese factor. You also have your own view of looking at China, because you've also been citing a lot on how the Chinese are interested in getting their weapons battle tested, often via proxies, and you give a lot of examples in your writings. Help us understand a little bit more.
So, China doesn't have an expeditionary force. You don't see Chinese troops engaged in other parts of the world. So it could be a strategy, or it could be a side benefit of the fact that they can see their arms being deployed elsewhere and try to learn from that experience. I mean, cumulatively, it has strategic significance. You can see how the foundation of the Turkish air defense systems was Chinese. I mean, there was a deal that it went south about the Turkey procuring a self-defense system, but there was technology transfer as part of that deal that significant part of it were materialized. And the Turkish, companies like Roketsan really took off because Turkey does have an expeditionary force and does learn from battlefields and have incrementally developed from an initial seed of knowledge. And if you do not deploy, you do not learn, and you do not incrementally improve.
Yeah.
And in that sense, China is also, in a way, indebted to Pakistan because they have deployed some of their best platforms. And what happened after Operation Sinjar was J-10s suddenly were more sought after. And also the J-17, which becomes an increasingly more Chinese platform. It requires new Chinese dimensions.
There's more sinification happening
yeah,
there gradually. Yeah.
Gradually.
Yeah. Although they are dependent on Russian engines and so on. But I think you've written about that. That gradually the sinification element is increasing.
Yeah, so they are now testing Chinese engines as well. And there is a transition. And initially there was in earlier variants, there was an Italian radar. Now it's a Chinese radar. I mean, there's increase, and so that's the modular approach on how you build something on subsystems. And that's how they're going about it. So the Chinese are learning from the deployment of both their platforms and their subsystems.
Okay, all right. Valid point. Group Captain Ahlawat, I mean, of course, this is a discussion that can go on for hours because it's very thought intensive. It's also, we can talk about so many aspects of it. But I just want to sort of ask your, let's say, some concluding remarks on, this phenomena that we are now trying to grapple with, which is that now there's more and more possibility of a ground-based invasion from the United States. So what we know for sure is that the escalation ladder is now going up and the war is here to stay. We are going to see more attrition. In that situation, what in your opinion is going to be the military strategy that we are most likely to see unfold, on both sides?
No, from a purely academic point of view, all the protagonists in this war have been rational actors. There have been no irrational steps so far. So US is stuck at a point that they seem to be incapable of achieving any of the objectives, which also keep changing. The regime changed in the sense the son replaced the father. The IRGC remained. They also wanted to eliminate Iran's nuclear weapon program, especially the almost 600 kg of highly enriched uranium that seems to be missing from the scheme of things.
And you were at the Worldview discussing, basically the deployment of the B-2 bombers, right? I'll put the link in the description box because Group Captain Ahlawat was here to discuss the how it unfolded and the military objectives, whether they were achieved or not. So this is about the last year's deployment that the US did. Yeah.
So unless under a deal Iran decides to hand over or provide access to that highly enriched uranium, you will have to send people in to get it.
Okay.
So ground invasion seems more likely. It's fraught with a lot of risk. I'm not sure whether the US president has the appetite for large number of body bags, but it remains an option. And we see signs that it could happen. The MEU is on the move. Even 82nd Airborne has been put on notice. He's also looking at other allies like the special forces from UK or other countries, or especially France, who have deep knowledge of the way Iranian system works. So it looks likely, but I'm not too sure whether it'll actually happen or not.
Right. And do you also think that there is a huge component that we have not discussed here, which has got to, of course, do with keeping the Strait of Hormuz open and, like that. So, I mean, in my opinion, I think we will see perhaps more action and some kind of a coalition around getting countries to try and keep it open, and so that the pressure on oil prices could be eased. But yeah, that's another speculative domain. Dr. Rubanis, what do you think? How is this going to unfold now that we have more and more reports and maybe some real possibility of a ground-based invasion from the United States?
So I do not think we're going to have a ground-based invasion. I think I have to take exception on the idea that all actors have been rational, but this would be completely irrational because you would need to cover a territory the size of Iran. You need a force at least double the size of what you deployed in Iraq.
Yes.
And you could end up in a situation which is like Syria on steroids. And
nobody wants that, I think, in the Gulf.
I don't think, irrespectively, let's put aside of what we want or we don't want, because it's that has to do with rationality. And I've given up trying to predict. Maybe I'm not rational enough. But I don't think people have the treasure and the weapons to do it.
Right.
I don't think they have the ammunition and the treasure and the people required to take this forward.
Ajay, you wanted to add to that?
No, only addressing the rational actor thesis of mine. Look at Strait of Hormuz, look at Iran, and look at US, all the players. Iran is exporting more oil today than it did before the war. Through the same strait, US is letting it because it keeps the energy prices under control. So, this is an indication of a rational game theory, rational actor in play. My reading.
Yeah. I don't know. In the long run, everything seems rational, but in the long run, we all die. I do not think there is an element of rationality here. I think we're making it up as we go.
Okay.
I think there is an escalation ladder that is not a ladder. It's leaps and bounds. And it's actually bouncing. We are not. I don't see coherence. If you don't want desalinization plants being targeted, you don't target desalinization plants. Yes, there is a tactical value in trying to isolate an island and make it non-usable so that you can control it. But you pick your fights, and I don't.
And here you're referring to Khark, right?
Yes, but I don't see fights being targeted. You don't go after a gas field unless you are willing to take on the cost that there will be, let's say, proportional countermeasures. Even proportional countermeasures could have a significant shock. And assuming that you have the operational capacity to open the straits, who's going to send their ships in a strait that potentially has mines? I mean, I heard this point being made that you could go down the beach and throw plastic bags in there, and people will not know what is inside.
Right.
And that alone will freak out all the insurance companies.
Yeah.
And if you don't want insurance, if you don't want insure ships, and you're willing to risk crews to go through there, you're talking about the shadow fleet, which is a ticking bomb, because these are not good quality ships, and you could have a big disaster.
Right.
And there is the moral issue of the crews as well. I mean, I'm sorry to say, it's as important as people getting their oil and gas.
Right.
But who loses out if the strait is closed today? US, not so much. Israel, not so much. Iran, maximum pain. China, great amount of pain. So look at the actors involved. Yes, you're right. It doesn't take much to plant mines in that strait. Very narrow, 20-22 mile. Even fishing boats can roll over drums and they could be mines. But who loses out? Isn't there rationality in the way things are?
But the mines are going out. The perception is there. Let's forget about the reality on the ground. The perception is there.
All
but
right.
the insurance companies are not insuring.
All right. No, it's great to sort of open this up and to also to to find out points on which experts tend to disagree, because that's what takes the conversation forward. Which is that yes, I mean this is an unprecedented situation, and I mean of course this is a worst case scenario that we were studying as students, and we are now seeing it unfold. So in many ways this is history in making, and I think what happens in the Gulf and the manner in which it ends or concludes is going to sort of decide the course of how we look at warfare and future warfare and protection of energy infrastructure and so on and so forth. So on that note, I have to thank the both of you for taking the time out. Group Captain Ajay Ahlawat, you have always been so liked and appreciated on the show. So very grateful that you took the time out today as well. And Dr. Ilia Rubanis, thank you for debuting at in our studio, because so far we have only done it remotely. So very happy to have you too, and I wish you a pleasant stay in India. And you were watching Worldview with Swasti. We will keep coming back to this issue and trying to understand who has the watch and who has the time. So you stay tuned.